Hello, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Cain Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on our leaders, where we will be covering all of the major current world leaders of our world. Today we will be covering Stefan Löfven, the current Prime Minister of Sweden, and Sophie Wilmès, the current Prime Minister of Belgium, as well as it pertains to the relevance with these two particular leaders as well. I will be covering a brief dialogue on socialism and capitalism and sort of the history of these two world phenomenon. So if you're curious at the end, I really hope you listen to that at the end as well. I'll be comparing these two individual leaders at the end, as customary in all of these documentaries that I'm creating. So without further ado, we will begin with Stefan Löfven. So Stefan Löfven is obviously a Swedish politician. He was born on July 21st of 1975. A couple of things that ring a bell here for me. Julius Caesar was born on the 13th of July. Not saying there's any philosophical similarity between these two individuals, but just to draw parallels and perhaps to advertise my other video previously on Julius Caesar. And as well, he was born 1 year after my father as well, which to me is just another thing that sort of gives me a connection with these leaders. And I recommend you do all of the same, just so the more you connect yourself with these leaders, the more I think you will start to embody their traits. He is the current Prime Minister of Sweden, and he has served in this position since 2014. He has also been leader of the Swedish Social Democratic Party since 2012, which is, as you'll see later, a more left-leaning, more socialist-based party in Sweden. And Sweden naturally has a more social bend than some of the more conservative or more capitalist nations across the world. So a more social party within a more social country is something to take note of, and I'll elaborate on that very clearly very soon. So in terms of his early life and education, he was born, as mentioned, on July 21st of 1957 in Aspudden, which is in southern Stockholm, which is the capital of Sweden and also the largest city in Sweden. It's also where they give out most of the Nobel Prizes, with the exception of the Peace Prize. However, he was placed in an orphanage after 10 months after birth. So actually, through this video series, he's the first leader that we've come across who's actually an orphan, which I think is something to take note of. I think obviously you would probably agree, and most others would agree, that growing up as an orphan is definitely a disadvantage, just by not having as strong of a core nucleic unit to fall back on, essentially. However, also one might feel perhaps different, but in some ways also special as well. So that obviously we have to take note of that in his character. He was moved to a foster family following this. He lived in an orphanage briefly in Stockholm. However, he quickly moved to a foster family in Sollefteå, which translates to sunlit region, or as well as loneliness or remoteness. So, and rightfully so, because it's a somewhat pretty remote little it's now considered a city as of 1917, however, and it's a rather small city at that, as it is often the case in Sweden. There are many smaller cities with the exception of Stockholm. The population, that being said, is only 8,562 people, so really, really quite small by any comparisons that we can derive. His mother, after giving him to the foster family, in the agreement said she would ultimately take back Stefan Löfven when she was ready to take care of him. However, that never actually occurred, so one might conclude that either she never ended up wanting him or she never became ready. One can only assume what might have been wrong, or the problem with her. Perhaps the father disappeared and she was not able to take care of the baby. Perhaps it might have been something relating to addiction. It's hard to say, but regardless, Löfven never met his mother. His foster father was named Tor Melander. He was a lumberjack and later became a factory worker. So this is where you can start to see why Löfven obviously has a support for those who work in the trades. He ultimately went to work in the trades for a time from himself, but his father was very hands-on sort of person. A lumberjack is, as you can definitely assume, it's a very hands-on job, and as well working as a factory worker is similar as such. His foster mother, Iris Melander, was also an in-home caregiver. So despite having coming from a foster family, I think he had two really great parents. His father and mother both worked, and they both, I think, really balanced each other out. His father being really, I guess you could assume more tough, but his mother also being more loving in nature, being a in-house home giver. So a very, I think, good family to grow up in. He attended Sophie High School in the small town of 8,500 people, and after graduation he attended a 48-week welding course through the AMU, or the Unemployment Training Center. So at this time, considering becoming a welder, however, no proof was found of him completing the welding course, nor having attained any work experience through this program. And he did this program in Kramfors, which is an even smaller city, it is considered, or you might even consider it a village of 5,990 people. So very small communities he grew up in. Despite being born in Stockholm, he really, I think it fostered in him a social spirit growing through in a smaller municipalities. It's the region is most known for, in many regions in Sweden, the best way to really climb out and get celebrity is through ice hockey. And here in Canada, we have a lot of famous Swedish ice hockey players. Another famous group is Abel as well. There are, very famous on the international stage, but nonetheless, growing up in such a small municipalities, I think it would have been, and coming from being an orphan, not coming from a necessarily rich foster family, I think he must have shown, or must have really believed in himself to have climbed as far as he ultimately did. Ultimately, after completing this, or whether or not he actually completed the welding course, he went on to Umeå University, which is in northeast Sweden. The regions he was in currently were about center-east Sweden, that being Sophie and Kramfors on the sort of eastern shore of Sweden, and he attended the Northeast Sweden University of Umeå. It's not one of the top universities in Sweden. Usually the top are considered to be Karolinska Institute, Lund University, Uppsala University, or Stockholm University. However, the school he did attend to was in the northeastern region, where he sort of grew up, and as well it's famous for industrial design. However, he did not even study industrial design. He actually studied social policy, or social work, pardon me. And I imagine he's probably wanted to study social work coming from being raised largely through the social system. He attended a publicly funded orphanage, and really it wasn't through the inheritance that his parents gave him, but really through the social network of Sweden that cared for him. And I can definitely see why he'd want to study social work. However, he even dropped out after 1.5 years. So for anyone who's listening or watching this and is considering leadership, don't take any disadvantage as a no. You might be an orphan, you might be a university dropout, you might not have even passed your welding course, but nonetheless, Löfven still went on to reach the highest seat of power in Sweden. So he obviously never took no for an answer. So after dropping out, he briefly did his compulsory military service with the Swedish military from 1976 to 1977, when he was 19 years old. He served as a common soldier and munitions systems specialist conscript in the Swedish Air Force at Jutland Air Force Wing, which is near Östersund, which is a larger city than he had previously grown up in, so it was probably a good experience for him. But nonetheless, he was on compulsory military service, so probably wasn't out in the city too much. But nonetheless, his favorite hockey team comes from this city. It's also the capital of Jutland, and it has a population of about 50,000 people. So starting to get a more urban experience and starting to really branch out of the smaller municipalities he grew in. And similarly, through this compulsory military service, it's very likely that he met lots of friends from different parts of Sweden and really grew up his social base, we could call it. In 1978, when he was 21 years old, he began as a welder at Hägglunds, which is a Swedish Defense Company, which is a subsidiary of BAE Systems, which is a British defense contractor. So a very, very large conglomerate, or I guess we could call it conglomerate, but based on military operations, and that's likely because he just finished his military service and went on to consider a natural career after that. And it is likely perhaps maybe he completed further welding courses here, or maybe this is actually proof that he did pass his 48-week welding process. However, I think that he was good enough at the job for him to actually rise in the ranks, as we will see. He worked in Ornskjoldvik, which is in Västernorrland county, which is about 32,000 people, so slightly smaller than Östersund, much smaller than Stockholm, but still a larger city compared to the one which his foster family grew up in and where he went to university as well. As he continued with this company, he ultimately became and was chosen division union representative, and this is really where his political involvement started. However, he did join the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Sweden at 13 years old, much previously, in the SSU Youth League, which it seems to be a very common process for all of these leaders to get involved in the youth leagues of the parties they would ultimately get involved in. One exception being Angela Merkel was actually involved in the Socialist Party, but then would go on to not be as a socialist by bent, but nonetheless she was involved in the youth league in her youth. And I think that's a very common thing that we've seen, particularly with our European leaders. But nonetheless, he was involved with the Social Democratic Party very early, and obviously showing his social bent. He studied social working at university. He worked in the military, and now he became elected as a union representative. So really taking for those, I assume you probably know, but a union is basically it's the organization of the workers to defend their rights against the perhaps more profit-driven leadership. So obviously, once again, emphasizing his support for social rights. In 1995, many years later, after serving a long time with the trade union, he was employed as a bondsman in the Swedish Metal Workers Union in contract negotiations and international affairs, representing the interests of metal workers. So once again, it's obvious that perhaps we can debate on whether or not he was a hard worker, but definitely he was an outspoken people for the social rights of his colleagues, and obviously they invested their trust in him. So it's obviously we can start seeing here that he was quite a good leader, but also people were willing to invest their protection in him through garnering him all of these roles. In 2001, at 44 years old, he became vice chairman of the Metal Workers Union, so continuing to climb through the ladder of the union. And in November of 2005, when he was 47 years old, he became the Swedish Metal Workers Union merged with the Swedish Industrial Union, to form the IF Metall, commonly referred to as just Metall, and was elected the first chairman of this combined union. So a very, very powerful role now, pretty much representing all of the interests of metal workers in Sweden. And as mentioned previously, 47 is, I think, probably maybe even a bit late to gain a hugely powerful role in terms of politics. However, nonetheless, he attained this powerful role and obviously shows his more left-wing or social bent. Following this, he had still retained his relationship or his membership with the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Sweden since 13 years old. However, in 2006, soon after, almost right after he became chairman of IF Metall, he was elected to the executive board of the Social Democrats. So the party really saw this rising unionist, and they thought, okay, what a great individual to include in our party. Following this, 6 years later, in January of 2012, Håkan Juholt resigned as leader of the Social Democrats, and he is actually now the ambassador, the Swedish ambassador to Iceland, which is it's sometimes ambassadors go into elected politics after, but often ambassador is sort of a later career honor role. I recently spoke to the current Canadian ambassador to China, Dominic Barton, who's actually was formerly we could in effect the CEO of McKinsey and Company, probably the top consulting firm in the world. But nonetheless, it's a very honorable role and a very, very powerful role as well. So, but nonetheless, Håkan Juholt resigned as leader of the Social Democrats, and Löfven was considered to be the successor as leader of the executive of the party. And the executive board nominated him, and very soon after, on the 27th of January, he was elected as leader in a party room ballot, which is sort of just an internal vote amongst the party on who should lead the party, and they chose him. So it seems like anyone that he chose to represent, or maybe it could be the other way around, all these people chose him to represent them. It's obvious that everyone he seems to have come across obviously had faith in him. Therefore, he was confirmed on the 4th of April 2013 in a biannual Congress as leader of the Social Democratic Party at 55 years old. In 2014, the European Parliament elections, which is essentially the way the European Parliament works, and as we'll see is actually the de facto head is in Brussels in Belgium, which we'll be covering very soon. Each constituent country sends forward MEPs or members from their own country to represent their country in the European Parliament. So now that Löfven was the current leader of the Social Democrat Party, it was his job to try to send as many Social Democrats to the European Parliament as possible. They performed at 24.9% of the vote, which is slightly inferior to the 2009 elections, and therefore Sweden sends 20 MEPs to the European Parliament. And of those, 6 of them were formerly Social Democrats, so he lost, or not necessarily all his fault, but the Social Democrats lost some votes and only sent 5 people to the European Parliament at this point, which was actually the lowest for the party since on a national level since 1921, but not much lower than the previous 2009 elections, but still quite a big defeat. You could say it's partially because maybe Sweden at the time was moving more to conservative, or more moving away from its social ideologies, or perhaps it was just because he was a new leader and wasn't able to garner enough support throughout or for his party. It's hard to say exactly what happened, but it's still a defeat. But it's very early in his leadership, so I don't think too much criticism can be attributed to it. In the 2014 general elections within Sweden, he won 31% of the vote, up from 30.7%, so 0.3 higher than in 2010, which was, but nonetheless still the second lowest for the Social Democrats in the Riksdag, which is the national legislature of Sweden, since the country got universal suffrage officially in 1921. And it therefore was once again a hung parliament, which essentially is basically that the government did not win enough seats to form government. So therefore, with some negotiations, he formed a minority government with the Green Party, which is even more left-leaning than the Social Democrat Party. Formerly, they had close allies with what's called the with a more left-leaning party. However, they abstained. Similarly, the alliance parties abstained. The only party to actually vote against him forming government was the far-right Sweden Democrats. So, but it seems like a lot of people were abstaining, but not as many were actually outwardly going against him. However, they did lose a former close ally. But nonetheless, through this hung government with the alliance with the Green Party, it was sufficient to form a government in Sweden, and he became prime minister. Therefore, on October 2nd of 2014, the Riksdag approved him at prime minister at 57 years old. So, what his goal was in going into the election was to negotiate more with the what's called the alliance parties, which are slightly more right-leaning or more center focused than the Social Democrats, and he wanted to negotiate them further with respect to the pension system, perhaps negotiating by giving it a more rightward bent, perhaps maybe decreasing pensions or perhaps reformulating the organization, as well as progressing future energy development and security and defense policy, which is something that the more centrist parties had been advocating for, especially as we'll see as we get close to the migrant crisis. So 2015, very soon into his elections, the migrant crisis in Europe really started to break out. This was largely caused by Islamic State gaining a lot of power then, and as well as in November of 2015, there was the Paris attack, which was a terrorist attack by some supposed migrants or perhaps Islamic State spies, you could call them. But nonetheless, 150,000 migrants came into Sweden, this country, and there was a lot of upset amongst the more right-leaning parties and individuals in Sweden. So therefore, to sort of try to bridge the gap between his party and the more right-leaning parties, he incorporated temporary residence permits, which was a way for allowing migrants to come in, but only for a temporary period of time. Similarly, he required, in many cases, total financial support for the migrants, which I think makes it a lot more difficult for migrants to come, because firstly, if a migrant is coming, it is likely because they do not have full financial support to begin with. And lastly, he also created a law forcing municipalities to share borders or share the burdens and the costs of the migrants. So most commonly in Europe, when the migrants do come, they tend to go to the larger cities, mostly to find work, because obviously there are more jobs in larger cities, such as Berlin or Stockholm in the case. But his policy here was that although the municipalities or the smaller regions were not gaining as many migrants, they should also share some of the burdens, perhaps by infusing some cash or other such practices. Lastly, he incorporated identity checks on the Danish-Swedish borders. So this was a really difficult policy to swallow, because the Reichstag, 175 of the members of parliament voted in favor, 39 against, and 135 abstained. So generally supportive to it, but a lot of abstains again. But what happened was the Nordic passport union, which had been established since 1954, before the birth of Stefan Löfven, it basically, to go between Denmark and Sweden, you required no passport. You could just drive across the border. But now, due to the migrant crisis, all individuals were required to show some ID to get through. So this is obviously seen as something that perhaps hurt relations with Denmark. However, also something that was very, very designed to hold back some of the migrants coming into the country. Denmark also similarly responded by incorporating a similar measure in relation to the German-Denmark border. So most of the migrants tended to go to Germany first at the time. So Denmark put in a wall, essentially requiring all people to show a passport to get through, or ID. Similarly, a case existed for Sweden as well. So obviously Denmark responded in suit, but led to a more divisive Europe than perhaps Angela Merkel or some of the other leaders would have liked. On October 3rd of 2014, going back in time a little bit, he announced the government would, in terms of international policies, they would recognize the state of Palestine as a country. This was actually the first country in the European Union to do this. Israel removed its ambassador from Sweden at this time. But I think this is a nice policy, and it shows that he is more nuanced. I don't think his somewhat tougher stance in relation to the migrants, I think, was partially just due to trying to satisfy some of the more centrist and right-leaning parties in Sweden. But I don't think it has anything to do with Islamophobia, for the very reason that he accepted Palestine as a country. And Palestine is, as you know, most predominantly a Muslim country. And the United States has not recognized Palestine as a country. In fact, recently they just accepted Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So I think it definitely shows that he is more nuanced in his opinion, and I definitely think that shows that he is definitely not an Islamophobe, despite perhaps taking certain measures to hold back migrants. In terms of the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, he has advocated that free trade between the US and EU is incredibly important. However, being from his natural left-leaning or social bent, he has advocated that the social conditions and human rights come before all of these free trade actions. So by that being said, he means that he would like to do as much trade as possible between the EU and the United States. However, if it is found that the social benefit is being sacrificed, he is willing to forego potential cost synergies. In 2017, he visited Ali Khamenei of Iran to improve economic relations. Once again, just showing that he's open to dialogues with those in the Middle East, and very, very much an open leader. He supports also relations with Saudi Arabia, which is a little bit of a more nuanced opinion because obviously Saudi is a more divisive figure in the Middle East, but he noted that it's important to build military contracts between the two nations. And this is likely because he served in a time through his compulsory military service, and also worked for a subsidiary of one of the largest defense contractors in the world. In 2018, the Reichstag voted no confidence in his government, so it was thought that the alliance parties would actually form a government. However, fortunately he managed, or fortunately at least for him and his party, he got 28.26% of the vote and eventually was re-elected with a coalition government with, once again, the Green Party, but he convinced one of the alliance parties, they call it the Center Party, to join him, and once again in 2018 formed government. So I think we'll be seeing much more of him. Perhaps I do like this individual. I think he represents a very important movement in terms of politics in Europe, and despite some of the more nationalist policies that he has, I think he represents a more globalist one, which is good, and I would like to see him further re-elected and further at least have time to show really what he is capable of, and I think we will. I think it's very likely that he will at least serve in a major role in Swedish politics in the future. In terms of his personal life, he supports Modo Hockey Club in Örnsköldsvik, which was the location where he worked for Hägglunds, one of the larger cities in Sweden. He also, interestingly enough, supports Tottenham Hotspur, which is a London-based football club. Where this interest comes, it's hard to say, but nonetheless, he's interested in football, or as the Americans call it, soccer, in London for some reason. He also supports GIF Sundsvall, the Swedish football club. And lastly, he's married to Ulla Löfven and has two stepchildren, actually. So she actually had two children before they even were married, and he actually has no biological children himself. This is, I think it's on one hand, it's sort of sad that he does not have any biological children at this moment, but it's also nice that, in effect, the people of Sweden and even perhaps the people of Europe and are his children in effect. So it's not that his influence is going to diminish at the end of his lifetime. I think his influence is probably larger than having a child of his own, depending on what the child would go on to do. But nonetheless, I think it's a nuanced fact that it's important to note that he has two stepchildren who he actually does love, and he does love his wife, but he has no children. Perhaps he was too busy, or perhaps he just never got around to it. It's hard to say. So moving into the quotes and the pictures. First, actually, we'll go with the pictures today. So the top right is the seal of Stockholm, where he was actually born, despite not actually growing up with his foster family. Below is the symbol of the Sweden Air Force. Below is the symbol of the IF Metall, which is the trade union that he ultimately became the chairman of. And down here is the symbol of the Social Democrat Party, which is the party that he is the head of. The population of Sweden is not very large at 10.23 million. There are cities that are larger than that. However, it has a quite whopping GDP of 556.1 billion, which is really quite large for a population of 10.23 million. And it has an area of 450,295 kilometers squared, which is, I would say, on the larger side as well. So, moving on to Sophie Wilmès, and then we'll go into a comparison and then a discussion on the differences of the philosophies of capitalism and socialism, which I think are particularly relevant for these two individuals. So Sophie Wilmès was born on 15th of January 1975. She is Prime Minister of Belgium and the first female to serve as head of government in Belgium. So that's an important feat for her. I think she's paving a good path for future leaders, for future female leaders in Belgium and globally. I think she should be a token of inspiration for any female interested in leadership. She officially only formed permanent government in March of 2020 as a result of COVID. But nonetheless, she served as a caretaker government since the 27th of October 2019. So she's been in the position for a very short period of time, but I think she will be a very important political force in the coming Belgian politics. So I think it's very important to cover now. In terms of her early life, as mentioned, 15th of January 1975, she was born in Ixelles, which is in the south of the city centre of Brussels, which is the capital of Belgium and the largest city. Ixelles is one of the 19 municipalities that form Brussels. It has a population, Brussels has a population of about 2.5 million people. It's not only the largest city in Belgium, it's also the richest and the densest. It's considered the de facto capital of the EU as the core of almost all the branches, with the exception of the judicial branches, all being in Brussels. It's actually a really beautiful building if you go there. Stockholm, I didn't mention before, is also a very, very beautiful city too. So I recommend visiting both of these places. Her father, Philip Wilmès, who died actually only 10 years ago in 2010, was a banker and professor and chief of staff to Jean Gaulle of the Liberal Reformist Party. So her father was involved in a more academic role in the government of Belgium, but nonetheless, it must be noted he was involved in a different political party than she ultimately became involved in. So I think that's an important thing to note, that in many cases, some of the individuals or leaders that we have covered came from a party that their father or their parents were involved in, but in some cases like this, they actually went in a different direction, which I think is very important, and I think that's a sign of good leadership, to actually take one's own way and to actually express manifest one's own philosophies. And on her father's side, something that is worth noting is that her paternal grandparents on her father's side, both of them, paternal meaning father's side, as you can probably conclude, both died in a World War II bombing. So this is something that obviously she wasn't there, but something that obviously is probably in the back of her head at all times. I know my father's father was in World War II, and he was in the Navy, and he was actually shot down by a Nazi U-boat. He survived and then went back onto another boat again, but the HMS Shadiac, which is actually in Nova Scotia. But nonetheless, it's always in the back of my head that, I guess I actually think her parents were more residential, but it's important to note that we're not very far removed from World War II, and I think it's important to remember these things and not forget it, even if, especially, I assume, or maybe perhaps you lived through it. Perhaps if you did live through it, you were very, very young, or unless you're very, very old today. But I think it's important not to forget, especially because I don't think these things are dead, and I think, for example, Nazism is perhaps even on the verge of coming back again. And all of these philosophies, Nazism, just to elaborate and not to go on too much of a tangent, Nazism is basically a political philosophy which is based on race, which is, as we're starting to see in some of the more nationalist countries such as India, I think it's clear that in India, Narendra Modi does think the Hindi people are superior to those of Islam, which is, I wouldn't say he's a Nazi, but it is sort of trending towards that. And yeah, nonetheless, I think it's important to note that World War II is very, very close in the rear view window and not too far removed, and that's why I think she knows this, and coming from such a global city as Brussels, I think it's very important that she as a leader is aware of this. Her mother, also is important to note, is Jewish, which means that in effect Wilmès is Jewish. She does not actually go to the synagogue or anything, but it is important to note perhaps her bend towards Palestine might be something more negative and more pro-Israel, so it's just important to note, and that's probably a place where she might disagree with Stefan Löfven. She grew up in Wallonia, in Grèce d'Ossau, which is a large region in Belgium. It actually takes up 55% of the territory, and it's predominantly French-speaking, so she speaks mostly French, but it's important to note that Brussels, for example, the two official languages are Flemish or Dutch and French. So there is a pretty large population of Flemish-speaking people in Belgium. French, for those who don't know, Belgian French is very similar to French. For example, in French, 90 is 70. However, in Belgium, they have septième, which is 70. So it's very, very similar, but there are a couple nuances. But nonetheless, Belgium has the distinct Flemish population, where about 90% of the population of the people in Belgium can speak French. It's important to note that there is this underlying Flemish or Dutch population that perhaps have felt somewhat misrepresented, and that's why it's important to note that Wilmès can speak Flemish, and she's one of the few people in her party who can, so that's likely one of the reasons that she rose to success in government. She went to St. Louis University in Brussels. It's not, once again, the most, and I don't want to talk too much about these because university rankings are very nuanced. Sometimes certain schools are good at particular fields. Usually the general rankings are just based on research output, which is often, or budget, which is not necessarily a good indicator of education. However, the top university in Belgium is generally considered to be KU Leuven, plus Ghent University is also very good, and also University of Antwerp. But also, it must be said that many people in Belgium, because it's such an international country, many do go study in France, many do go study in the UK, or many do go study across Europe as well. And perhaps another reason she went to this particular university, St. Louis University, is that it's in the capital, which might have been one of the main things that drove her towards it. It's hard to say, but nonetheless, she got a degree in applied communication, actually, and then ultimately a master's degree in financial management. With this degree, she served as a financial advisor in a law firm in a Flemish suburb of St. Gentius Road, which is in Flanders, which is a Dutch region of Belgium. So obviously, living here, she must be pretty good Flemish. I do not speak Flemish, so I cannot elucidate how great her Flemish is, but I assume she's pretty well fluent and at least recognized or respected amongst the Flemish speaking population. In 2000, at 25 years old, pretty young actually to get involved into politics, but as I said, I think females do tend to mature a little bit earlier, so 25 is like 30 for a male nonetheless. She became a councillor in Uccle, which is one of the 19 municipalities in Brussels. So it's very common, as you'll see in many of these more developed democracies, for people to start in municipal politics, to go into provincial politics, to go into federal politics in that order. Contrary is also quite strange, but this is not a necessary or a sufficient process. However, it definitely, I think, does help to gain the skills and understanding of the three divisions of government. In 2007 to 2014, for 7 years, from 32 years old to 39 years old, she became first alderman in charge of finance, budget, francophone education, communication, and local business for the town of St. Gentius Road, which has a population of about 18,000 people. The same city, she served as a financial advisor in a law firm. It's I said population about 18,000, a large Flemish speaking population, but it must be noted that in this role as alderman, she actually served as the alderman partially of French speaking education. So obviously, despite perhaps being a good Flemish speaker, she also is a very in tune with the needs of the French-speaking population. On October of 2014, she was elected to the Chamber of Representatives, which is the equivalent of the lower house in Belgium. So once again, very clearly elucidated here, she went from municipal to provincial to federal politics in 2014. And it's one of the two houses of the bicameral parliament in Belgium, the lower house. And they also have a Senate, so a very common federal system in Belgium, but nonetheless finally gets to federal politics as an elected representative. September of 2014, Harvey Jamar resigned ultimately stepping down from the role in 2015 to become the governor of the province of Liège. So this is, as I said, very uncommon for Harvey Jamar to move from federal politics back into provincial politics. However, moving from essentially a member of parliament to a governor is a step up in power. However, it's backwards in terms of scope. But nonetheless, she went in and took his role as Minister of Budget under Charles Michel's first government. Charles Michel will talk about very clearly and very soon. I'll start even right now. He is currently the president of the European Union, so a very important individual who came from Belgian politics. In 2018, in Michel's second government, she became Minister of Budget, Civil Service, National Lottery, and Scientific Policy. So once again, a really hodgepodge of different interests or different causes, but I think it's because she's very capable and very broad in terms of talents. However, in this time, in 2018, the government collapsed. There was disagreements over the handling of the Global Compact for Migration, which was a UN-proposed compact upon the constituent states of the European Union. The NVA party rejected this, and ultimately there was essentially collapse in the government in Belgium. And thus, Michel resigned and maintained as a caretaker government. So the party was not faring too well. However, in 2019, he lost further seats, but still managed to form government as an interim prime minister. However, he left this role, Michel, as prime minister of Belgium to succeed Donald Tusk as president of the European Council. So this is actually probably something that's particularly relevant in Belgium, as mentioned, municipal politics to provincial politics to federal politics. But being in Belgium itself, in Brussels itself, you could move all the way to the government of the European Union, and he went all the way to the top of president of the European Union, which is a very, very powerful and important role. And perhaps that might be something that Sophie Wilmès might ultimately accomplish. So only time can tell. But nonetheless, she was very much involved in the negotiations for a coalition government, and she served as a caretaker government prime minister at this point. And actually, even up until the March 16th of 2020, just this year, she was actually not permanently prime minister because there was so much difficulties forming a coalition government after the fallout with relation to the migrant negotiations. However, due to COVID-19, the King of Belgium declared that Sophie Wilmès should form a permanent minority government despite not having enough people in the House of Commons or the lower house. She would form a government as a safety measure against the COVID-19 outbreak. So nonetheless, very recently she became the first female prime minister of Belgium. In terms of politics, she's very much actually aligned with her party, but I think it's important to note that she does have a Flemish background, so I think she definitely has more support from that side than some of her contemporaries. During the COVID-19 outbreak, she visited a hospital, and all the staff turned their back towards Sophie Wilmès because they saw that Belgium had, at the time, the highest mortality rate as a cause of COVID-19. I don't know if that's It's not, I don't even know if it's necessarily true, but nonetheless, they believed it, but she did not believe it. She thought it was overestimated. But nonetheless, she has received some criticism for how they addressed COVID-19. But I would also say, which leader has not received criticism for how they address COVID-19? I think they're few and far between. So in terms of the actual politics of or policies of the Mouvement Reformateur Party, which is that which she is the head of and Prime Minister through, and Michel came from, and she even says her policies are almost fully aligned with it. It's been criticized for favoring the French population. That's likely why she has been selected as the leader, because she has a more Flemish bent, and she is the actual only Flemish speaker, a major speaker in the party. So that's obviously a very big asset on her part. It's classified as classical liberalism, and they promote free market economics and free trade. However, since the time of Dirk Verhofstadt, they've moved towards more social liberalism, which is slightly more towards Stefan Löfven, more social policies, higher taxes, and but more support, more broader distribution of the tax money. So I think that's probably the trend that the party's moving in. And as we'll see in the quotes, the as we'll move to both their quotes, she is moving from a more individualist or capitalist stance to a more social one. In terms of her personal life, she married in 2009, so relatively early, but later in her life, for I suppose a woman at 33 years old in May, to an Australian footballer and businessman, Chris Stone, the first, and he actually already had a son with a previous relationship. However, since then, since 2009, they've had 3 more daughters. In terms of the images, and my apologies, I did not go through Stefan Löfven's quotes, but I'll go through them all at the same time. In the top right is the symbol of Brussels. Lower is the symbol of her university, UC Louvain. Down here is the symbol of the town through which she grew up in, that being Saint Gentius Road. Down below here we have the symbol of the MR party, or the Mouvement Reformateur Party. And down below we have the symbol of the lower house, or the House of Commons in Belgium. As always, here's the flag of Belgium. The population is slightly larger than that of Sweden at 11.46 million. Very small difference, less than a million more. GDP is slightly smaller at 542.8 billion, but once again very close. However, the area is substantially smaller at 30,689 kilometers squared, yielding a much higher population density. So in terms of both of their quotes, and then we'll move into the comparison, and then the sort of more ideological dialogue, which I'm quite looking forward to actually. The first quote from Stefan Löfven: "The billions we are investing in welfare are a clear signal that this government stands for building up society, not tax cuts. The Swedish model is not going to be scrapped but developed." So this is very clear that he is a more social bent. He says we are not going to engage in tax cuts because our welfare state depends on this. So very clear ideological inference there. "We have taken in too many for too long. We need a pause for breath." And this is in relation to the migrants moving in to Sweden in 2015 particularly. This is obviously showing that he's a little bit more hesitant than some of his counterparts. However, to address this further, the idea was never that European cooperation would be a way to shut out people who are fleeing. So kind of mellowing that down a bit, he does still believe that the people who are fleeing should be allowed to seek refuge. He just thinks that perhaps there might be more measures necessary. And finally, to close this one off, Sweden and Germany and few other countries cannot do this on their own. So similar with his policy, where he saw that the municipalities need to share some of the burdens that particularly Stockholm was experiencing, he thought that perhaps Sweden and Germany and perhaps a few other countries that he notes were taking an undue burden in terms of the migrants moving into Europe, and he just wants to see it more spread. And that's a very social policy, as we'll see He wants to sort of spread not only all the benefit, but spread all of the potential costs. So that's very much elucidates further his philosophy. In terms of the quotes of Sophie Wilmès, day after day, I try to improve the everyday life of everyone in a dynamic, rigorous, and transparent way. My political actions are guided by the liberal values which have always been by the movement reformateur. So as mentioned, that's why I sort of derived most of her philosophies, because she's been relatively new to the position, because she clearly says in this statement that her policies are almost completely aligned with those of the movement reformateur party. But perhaps as she gets older and perhaps progresses or spends more time in this leadership role, perhaps she might start to diverge more from the philosophies of her party. I wish to participate actively in the construction of a civic, responsible, and sustainable society in which everyone feels safe. So this is just sort of her overall message and her overall objective as Prime Minister of Belgium. But mostly I think we should particularly focus on for everyone, and that's sort of more of a social cause. But I think it's also inclusion of those of minority races, and even those of the immigrants. And that was one of the things that caused the MR party to have to form a caregiver government, because one of the other parties opposed the UN enforced policies with respect to migration. So I think that is something that where she is perhaps similar to Löfven, sort of a nuanced opinion, but still thinks that everyone should be entitled to similar opportunities, not the same outcomes. To achieve this goal, there is no fix. I am convinced that the multiplication of initiatives, both public and individual, will ultimately make the difference to make Belgium a country with a robust economy where the quality of life of everyone continues to improve. So this really sums up what I'm trying to get across in this video. She says the multiplication of initiatives, both public and individual. So both public and individual, what she means by that is the social and the capitalistic. Capitalistic is basically get what you earn, and public is, sort of give back. But she mentions the multiplication of energy, and that's alluding to synergies, that there has to be both. We cannot have a complete socialist state, because then we'll never get any innovation and never get any progression. And I think we'll get a sort of Atlas shrugged sort of moment. However, there's synergies also by promoting the individual. So a culmination of the two, there will be a multiplication, not addition, a multiplication between the two. So I think that's where perhaps maybe she's a little bit more on the capitalistic than Löfven, just by nature of her country. But both of these individuals understand that there is a social cause that must be addressed, but also a capitalistic or individual cause that must be addressed. So this moves us into the comparison. So basically what I want to get across is that Löfven is slightly more social, coming from a union background, and Wilmès is slightly more on the individual side of the spectrum, but both of them are more on the social side than either. But Wilmès is slightly more on the individualistic side because she comes from a financial advisor background and slightly more conservative upbringing than that which a trade union renders. So what I want to start with here is the story of Cain and Abel. And I'm sorry, I know a lot of people don't like to talk about religion, but I think we'll just do it because it's an important book. I don't think if it was a bad story, it would have been tossed away. And it's one of the oldest stories in history. It's actually very, very early in the Bible. So the story of Cain and Abel are the first men after Adam and Eve. So Cain is the older brother, and he inherits the land that his parents gave him, Adam and Eve gave him. And his younger brother Abel becomes a shepherd. But nonetheless, Abel seems to be, for some reason, much, much more successful. And Cain gets very jealous and ultimately, to jump to the punchline, kills Abel. So the point is, when I first heard this story, I thought it was very obvious that Cain was just a greedy individual and had no right to kill Abel. But the point that I need to get across here is that Abel is also culpable. He had a responsibility in some way. To what extent? It's hard to say. Maybe to the extent that he could have saved his own life, to have perhaps maybe helped Cain. the point is there's many other stories. In any situation, you might have a friend, you might have a brother, you might have a sister. In any two-person relationship, one person has earned more and one person has earned less, and there will always be a Cain and Abel, and the Cain will always be jealous of the Abel. This is an archetypal story because it's the extreme. So Cain was given everything, Abel earns everything. But the point I want to get across here is that Abel represents the capitalistic nature in that he earned his wealth, and the purely capitalistic argument is that he deserves everything that he earns and he has no obligation to give Cain anything. But the socialist argument, and that being the Cain argument, is that Cain thinks that Abel owes him something. So I think Cain was obviously wrong to kill Abel, but I think and I believe that Abel is maybe not as equally as culpable, but he had an obligation. Maybe not, he should not have given everything he earned to Cain, but he had an obligation to somewhat appease Cain, and perhaps even to the extent to save his own life. So the point here is that, and this is how pretty much every revolution in history has occurred. We'll start with the French Revolution. So what happened was Louis XIV became too powerful. Essentially, he created Versailles, very central government, and the people just thought that that was too much. And through the rhetoric of Robespierre, they had Louis XVI killed and overthrew. This is, you could say, Robespierre and the populist people of killed Abel, who would have been the king, or essentially the individual who had everything. So this will always happen if Abel does not do a little bit to try to appease the Cains of the world. The same thing, we'll look at the case of Russia, where Nicholas II, the last of the Romanovs, was killed because he started to abuse his power. At the time, the Romanovs had absolute control over all of Russia, and the people saw that this was just too much, and he was abusing his authority, and thought and believed and ultimately did kill him and all of his family. Same thing with him in Louis XVI. They killed him and all of his family. So the point is that, is it wrong to be a king? Is it wrong to have lots of wealth? Is it wrong to achieve great things? Well, I think perhaps the monarchical example is an extreme, and probably no. But there is always the argument that those who earn have an obligation to give back a little bit to the Cains of the world. And that's the message of the story. And that's the part of the story that I actually missed. I thought that Abel was the good guy by default. But Abel could have done a better job. And he could have, obviously, are these real people or not? Who knows? And probably a similar story has happened in many times. That's why most murders happen, is through greed and jealousy. But nonetheless, he could have given Cain a little bit more of a helping hand to, if anything, save his life. And that's an obligation that always exists. Adam Smith and Ayn Rand I don't think they're as extreme as many people make them out to be, but you cannot have complete capitalism because the people will ultimately get jealous and kill you, but you cannot completely deprive any of those with talent or any of those who make things or any of those who have power from that which they have. Otherwise, they will cease to work and you'll fall into an Atlas Shrugged. So that being said, I think we can agree that a little bit, to what extent, has to be given, has to be shared for social causes. We cannot have a completely individualistic society, because that would be not only insane wealth gaps, but there would also be probably rampant murder, because that would just be the case. So there has to be a little bit, and the best way to do that is through taxation. So I was recently reading the Federalist Papers, particularly the parts recently by James Madison, who was actually the fourth president of the United States of America and also one of the original drafters of the Constitution of the United States. So what he says is that there must be some taxation on behalf of the federal government for the preservation of the Union, being the United States, which I think anyone can agree. I think if we had one unified country, one unified world, I don't think we would need that tax for that particular reason, but there would still be self-defense against perhaps, meteorites or aliens if it ever came. But nonetheless, a certain amount of tax for a social benefit of preservation of the state is necessary. So that is like absolute baseline. How much that must be? Well, it probably depend in proportion to the risk. But similarly to that, we must add, for example, I don't think anyone would disagree that the fire department is a social benefit. If it becomes a private benefit, well, then people are incentivized to burn down buildings, right? If we had if I started a fire company, why would I not light every building on fire and then pay me to put them out? So it just wouldn't work. It has to be a social benefit, and I think most people would agree with that. Like, okay, I'll dish out a little bit of taxes to prevent, if my house burns down, to call the firemen and save me. And, I'm okay if my neighbor gets burnt down, if I pay a little bit so that it helps. So to that, there are certain additions, certain social benefits that must be added to this taxation. And Abel has to just give up a little bit. And even Cain's the inheritor of the land. He'd be giving up some too. But nonetheless, these small amounts do exist, and it can't go too far. To what extent is up to a great and large debate, but it must be a certain amount. So here is an image of, as you can probably assume, this is Cain up here on top, killing Abel. So that's the message here, and that's what I want to get across in this video, is that the policies that Löfven, and I think a lot of people are scared of, they don't like the word socialism because it leads to communism, but they also don't like capitalism because it can lead to, for example, tyranny if someone gets too powerful. And as we look at today's politics, right now I don't think any country is particularly on the verge of collapse, because it happens to be that those in the most powerful are willing to give back. For example, I would say the most powerful people in the United States. The United States is just a particular example, but for example, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and maybe Warren Buffett or Michael Bloomberg, and formerly and currently probably Donald Trump. Most of these people, obviously, many people don't like them, but they do make an effort to not abuse their power. Because if they did abuse their power, they would be killed, and history has shown this time and time again. So the point is, there must be a balance of socialism and capitalism, and without the two wings, we can even call them, the world will crumble. So thank you so much for watching this discussion on Löfven and Wilmès, Stefan Löfven and Sophie Wilmès, of the current Prime Minister of Sweden and the current Prime Minister of Belgium, respectively. And yeah, thanks. I hope you continue to support. Thanks so much.